Andrew Wood, who is the Senior Engagement and Impact Officer for the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, is going to speak for about 5 minutes to the climate talking points as an introduction to then the panel that will follow. Andrew has a background as a planning and sustainability consultant and an environmental campaigner. His role at the Commission is to build the application and impact of our work on local policy making, the planning system, and to contribute to influencing national policy. So, Andrew, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you very much, and good evening. Yes, I'm hoping that you can now see my slides. Thanks for the introduction, and it's great to see so many people here. I'm not going to talk in particular detail about the policy changes in the talking points, because that's obviously what we're hoping that our speakers will have a much better place to do. So the aim of the work here is to produce a clear and straightforward agenda for policy change that we're confident applies, whatever the outcome of the forthcoming the local, and the mayoral, and the national elections that are facing us this year. And it's really heartening that each of our vice chairs, who come from across the region and across the party political spectrum, have been happy to support the work. So firstly, a quick reminder, the policies and the decisions that we put in place now will make a genuine difference to the future that we experience, in particular, I think the future that our children and grandchildren experience, because our success in reducing carbon emissions has an impact on the warming scenarios that we're looking at, and the warming scenarios have an effect on the places we live in, the kind of weather we experience, and the state of nature. So we know that the public support for, and the public the scale of sort of like the appetite for climate change is strong, and we know that most people are to a greater I'm just being attacked by a cat, excuse me, to a greater or lesser degree worried about their future in a changing climate. But action is not really keeping up with that demand. So in the talking points document, we've identified the general types of action that are needed in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of rebuilding nature, and recognizing that the only viable future economically is a green future. And ultimately, it's about making people's lives better, because people have to be able to live and thrive in a changing climate. And as we pursue that, we have to specifically address the changes that are facing the people who are now already struggling. So there are lots of specific actions within each of those areas, and through our work at the Commission, we know of projects that are happening in the region, operating in all these areas of action. And one thing that's really striking from talking to our colleagues in the local and the combined authorities, mayoral authorities, is how determined they are to make progress on these actions, because they're responsible for the future of their places, and they know that all these actions are necessary. The problem being, at present, only a very small number of those actions really are genuinely supported by national level regulation and policy. So we have seen a strengthening of the regulatory requirements for nature recovery, which is great. And whilst it's perhaps faltered a little recently, efforts to decarbonise our fuel sources, particularly around the electricity grid, are continuing. But looking at all the other bullets on this slide, which I won't go through, but you can see that they're there. There's not a great deal else of those actions that are genuinely supported by national regulation and policy. And I don't think that really translates to a lack of interest or appetite at national level. My impression is that most civil servants and the majority of national politicians want to do this, and they ultimately they have to do it, and they're trying to do it. But the real gap, the real problem, I think, seems to be around lack of strategic approaches, actions being sort of divided up between different strategies with different organisations or departments leading them, and lack of joining up, in particular around how budgets and investments are planned and implemented. So when you look at the talking points, the policy changes that we've identified to unlock action, which are basically enabling places to go further and faster on their carbon reduction journey, having much more integrated, integrated locally managed and longer term funding pots to enable that joined up work to happen, seeing that various strategies need to be interlinked and that they look to tackle society's other big challenges alongside climate, and take a much more nature first approach to publicly funded infrastructure, so that we can build the health and the resilience of nature. These are messages we hear again and again from all sectors, from senior leaders as well as individuals and businesses. And I think you can hopefully see that what they all amount to really is addressing just those two gaps I mentioned: the need for joined up strategy and for joined up funding and financial planning. So to conclude, whatever the outcome of the various elections that will be taking place this year, speaking as objectively as possible, these are the changes that we need future policymakers to be embracing. So that's my introduction. I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to hearing from our other speakers as to how this chimes with their experience in their different areas of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Sorry, I was taking a little bit of time to unmute myself. Thank you, Andrew, very much for that introduction to the why wherefores of the climate talking points and their importance, especially in an electoral year, and how we can all use them to put pressure on our political stakeholders. The next sort of half an hour, 35 minutes, we'll see how we go, and I'll manage it carefully, but also generously because we have time, are the reflections from the panel with regard to these talking points and the 4 policy changes that Andrew has just taken us through. It's Melanie, Rachael, Amogh, Niki and Paul who are going to speak. I'm going to introduce each one of them in turn, and I'll start with Mel. But just to say, I'm going to keep you 5 to 5 minutes, but I won't say anything until the 5 minutes is up. So if there's a sort of 30-second addition that's needed to finish your comments, that's fine, because I don't want to interrupt you. So 5 minutes each. Please try and keep to the time with your own stopwatches. Thank you very much indeed. So Melanie Taylor. Mel is the founder of Just Strategy, a northern-based strategy consultancy for place-based, customer-centric net zero transitions. She is the co-chair of the Commission's Communities and Engagement Panel and is a non-exec board member of Solutions for the Planet and the Northeast and Yorkshire Net Zero Hub. Mel, over to you.
Thank you, Richard, for that introduction, and hello everyone. It's really lovely to be speaking with you tonight. It feels like a really timely moment to be having a conversation about bold leadership, and I know that the timeliness is partly because we've got this whole variety of different elections coming up on the horizon, but I think it's also timely because there's a feeling at the moment, or certainly a feeling that I have, of a bit of stuckness in climate policy. And I think you can feel that feeling if you're working in policy, or even if you're just watching it on the telly, just this sense that a lack of surety, where policies that we had thought we're pretty steadfast and nailed on, suddenly no longer feel so steadfast and nailed on. And I think that feeling has been coming kind of thick and fast over the last couple of months, really, and from all political parties across the board. So I think there is a real sense at the moment that it is time to call again for bold leadership on climate change, and the talking points that we've developed, I think, are a really great start to that. There are a few points that I wanted to raise before we start getting into the detail of each of those talking points, but that I guess touches on each of them in a way. Is a few themes that I think cut across all of these. The first is that we need the right leadership at the right levels. And I think probably it's safe to say that up until now, particularly on a lot of the work that I do is on energy policy, a lot of the focus really has been on national policy. And I think that's true across a number of the policy areas that we're talking about. But I think increasingly there's a recognition that if we want a just transition, we really need to be making these sorts of policy choices at a local level, and at a local level where we're really able to engage the communities that those policy changes are going to affect, where they get to influence how those policy changes play out within their lives. And I think that's the really key important point for me around our talking point one, about that ability of places to use local targets and go further and faster if they want to. And I think that's really key, is that actually at that local place-based level, that's where we have the potential to really understand what the local ambition is and make sure that we are moving at a rate that doesn't leave people behind. The second point that I'd make, as well as making policy at the right geographic level, is making policy at the right time. You might be aware, or you might not, that there was quite a lot of controversy in Germany over the last year. And it all started because the German government announced a policy that from the next year, so from this year that we're in now, you wouldn't be able to replace your gas boiler. You would need something else. And this caused an awful lot of concern and worry in Germany. And I'm sure there were lots of reasons for that. But the biggest reason that people stated was simply that they just didn't feel that they'd had enough time. And I think it's really important for government and policymakers at all levels to make sure that they're flagging to communities at the earliest possible time what will be expected and what is required as part of that transition. And again, the only way that you can do that is to have very sort of clear and credible plans about what policy levers you're going to use, and also how you're going to support the most vulnerable in society to be able to make that transition as those policy levers start to come in. And I think that crosses over a number of those talking points, being able to set local targets, but also increasingly being able to have the funding pots that are there that you can direct into the communities that really need them to be able to make that transition. And then finally, and I guess I've touched on this a few times already, I probably bang on about it a lot, I guess it's my job to bang on about it a lot, is the need to engage communities in every aspect of policy development across each of those talking points, whether it's reducing emissions, developing local targets, how we use local funding pots, how we get the right set of skills and make sure that people are supported to have the right skills to get into the right jobs so that we can have the economic growth that we want, how our cities need to look and feel. All of that needs to be done in a collaborative and really open-hearted way to be able to bring the widest set of views in. And that's not always views that agree. Sometimes, it is finding ways to sit down and be able to hear and take on board a whole variety of views and opinions as we start to develop the cities and the towns and the communities that we need to have in future. So I feel like am I getting towards my 5 minutes? I can carry on, Richard.
Mel, love it, but no. Thank you very much, Mel. Obviously, you come back in the question and answers and continue your line of reasoning. That's great. Thank you very much for being so clear and to the point. I'm going to turn now to Rachael Balmer. If Rachael can come through.
I'm here. Yes. Thank you very much, Richard.
I'm going to let me just introduce you so people know who you are. Rachael is a chartered planner who has worked in local government planning in Yorkshire for over 20 years in both development management and planning policy. And she's currently one of the planning policy managers at North Yorkshire Council and leading on how our new local plan is going to respond to climate change. Rachael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me along to this event so that I can sort of get involved in the engagement on what is a really important issue for all parts of the country, not just North Yorkshire. I'm primarily coming from a local government perspective because that's where I'm sort of one of the sort of key actors in this sort of play around how we respond to reducing our carbon emissions, and specifically as well, my background is in planning, so it's very much from the perspective of the local planning authority. And the sort of 4 policy aims, I think that they are really, really important that we take them forward. I would say that they're very useful as approaches to consider, and they're necessary to take forward. The first one, when it talks about empowering local communities to set their own targets, I think from the planning systems perspective, we're very frustrated at the moment. There was a recent written ministerial statement produced by the government, which, whilst we understand we need to ensure that when we create different targets for carbon emission standards in buildings in terms of their energy use and things, that they have to be a standardized process, but the government has placed further restrictions on us in how we do that. And the Town and Country Planning Association and a range of bodies have written to the government to ask them to reconsider this process. So I'm hoping that does go forward into the future, and we can set more flexible standards around how we look at reducing carbon emissions in specifically in relation to buildings. We're at a very early stage in the preparation of our local plan, which is a very sort of prescribed process, but we do want to have engagement going forward, and events like this will be an opportunity for us to hear how our communities are feeling about what is such a pressing issue. In relation to coordinating funding streams, obviously now York and North Yorkshire, they're a combined authority, there is devolution, there's that centralised funding pot, and I'm hoping that in itself will start to help a better sort of collaboration and coordination of funding that's available to allow us to create some really quite strategic and innovative infrastructure that can help then support our journey to net zero and beyond. In relation to having joined up strategies that look to support to reduce poverty, improve nature resilience, respond to the sort of zero emission agenda, that's something that the local plan will have to do, because a local plan you have to read as a whole, and it covers a whole range of issues around where we locate new development, how do we protect important landscapes in our plan area, and we have a time frame to create that local plan now of just 4 years, and that plan will be in place. It will have a timeline of effectively 15 years. So we need to really get a grip on how we're going to address and respond to climate change throughout our local plan, and allow that to take forward, because if we miss the opportunity that we have now, it's really quite a significant and serious thing for us to do. Then in relation to considering things around a nature first approach as well, there are various strategies that are emerging. They have, it's a local nature recovery network strategy. There is a project around looking at private investment in looking at nature resilience and different infrastructure projects that can be taken forward to improve the environment around flood risk and using sort of nature to both build resilience and help to reduce climate emissions. We also have what's come in recently. It's coming in part, but it'll be coming in March in full, which is mandatory requirements to have on planning proposals what's termed biodiversity net gain. And that's a sort of measured quantum of biodiversity contribution that you're making on a specific site. And that's come through from the Environment Act. And that's something that planning applications have to consider now, basically, and will have to do so going forward. So there is hope. There is a number of key positive things happening, but it's events like this that are setting out a key strategy that we can take to central government and other sort of political arenas is really important. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Bang on time. Thank you indeed. And you'll come back obviously in the Q&A following up. So can I turn now to Amogh Nagendra? Amogh, please come forward on the screen.
Hi.
Thank you. Amogh, very good to see you. I'm just going to introduce you. Amogh is representing the RYCA, which is the Regional Youth Climate Assembly. RYCA provides a collective youth voice for young people within the climate discussion at the regional level. It encourages young people living in the Yorkshire and Humber region to represent their local authority and to join the pool of discussion when it comes to young people's futures. I think whilst the first two panelists have focused on policy changes 1, 2, and 4, Rachel ending with 4 on biodiversity and nature first. I think, Amogh, if I'm right, you're going to sort of talk more comprehensively of all 4 or react to all 4 in general. Anyway, Amogh, over to you.
Hi, so can I just start by saying thank you? I think it's a great opportunity, and I think it's great that you're getting young people's views as well, because obviously climate change is a problem that affects everyone. It's not just a certain group of people. It's not just policymakers who get affected. It's every single person in the world. And I think the climate talking points, they're all amazing. I think they were all needed sort of to lead policymakers on the right path, if you like. But I'd like to start with the first one, the empowering places and local councils and local authorities talking point. I think we need to empower local peoples because it's their planet and they should do something as well. And I think to do that, education is key, along with sort of advertisement about green jobs, skills, all of these terms that we hear all the time, but not necessarily know what they mean. I don't think a lot of people actually understand what climate change is going to affect, how climate change is going to affect them personally. I think the education is definitely severely lacking in schools from a young person's point of view, but I think it's also severely lacking in general. I mean, going back to schools, it's only taught in geography or science, but that's only been brought in sort of very recently. So, I mean, I doubt your average 30-year-old, 40-year-old, if you ask them, oh, what can you do to save the environment? How will you help solve climate change, or what actually is climate change? I think they'll understand, oh, climate change, yeah. They might some links in their heads, and they've seen something on the news, a polar bear falling into the sea, ice caps melting. They see all of this, but I don't think they really understand the severity of the issue. And I think that needs to be solved, because really, if you're taught that the polar bears are dying. The sad truth is, people are going to say, "Oh no, I'm really sorry." They maybe empathize with it for a couple of minutes, but they won't really care. No, I know it's sad and a bit horrible to say, but it's the truth. And I think the problem is that people don't know how it's going to affect them individually. And so they think, oh, climate change is just an issue that's going to be, it's there, but it's not actually affecting me. So why should I help? Why should I do anything? Obviously, and they think global warming, let's say, and assume that it's on a global scale. How can something that I do possibly, come to anything that's actually going to have any impact? And I think so. Education is definitely a massive point that I think needs to be put on there. I think it was missed out a bit. Is from my from young person's point of view, especially when you talk about empowering people to, put them on a clear path. I think even in councils, I mean, I know that Rotherham Council, I'm from Rotherham, and Rotherham Council, we're on an ongoing bid to get everyone in the council carbon literacy certified. And basically the young people in Rotherham, we have a Rotherham Youth Cabinet, which is sort of a group of 11 to 18-year-olds who are quite passionate about change in Rotherham. And we we represent the views of Rotherham young people on a sort of more local and regional scale. And even we are actually carbon literacy certified now, all of our members, and we're currently working on an e-package to send out to schools and for local council members. Obviously, it's not going to be carbon literacy certified because it's a copyright. It's going to be our own accessible version for that anyone can access. You be, an 11-year-old or an 8-year-old, and they can go on there, they can learn about climate change, see what they can actually do, and hopefully that makes people the solution instead of the problem. And I think that's something that we really need to work on as a region. And I'd like to go on to the second climate point, the climate talking point now as well, actually, where it talks about funding pots, create locally managed funding pots. I think it's great. I think it's obviously needed. Money is scarce at the moment, but I think we also need to understand that we can't just spend to sort of tick a tick box, if you like, to just say, oh, look, we've done this. Look at, all these things that we've done. Vote for me. It's not that. That's not what we're trying to get here. We're trying to actually make some change. We're actually trying to get something out of the spending. So it needs to be meaningful spending. There needs to be, how can the problem actually be solved with us spending this money? And, just an example of this is in London, I'm sure you all know, they spent £15 million on cycle superhighways, which is basically just some blue paint on a road. And if you ask any cyclist, because I cycle myself, I cycle everywhere I go. If you ask any cyclist, they're not going to. It's just not safe. You have to put going on a dual carriageway. Cars are going at 40 miles per hour, 50 miles per hour, and you're cycling on the side of the road, or you've got lorries, trucks, buses going past you. It's not practical. And 5 people tragically died within just 9 days of it opening. And it's just an example of where they've spent the money. They've just spent £50 million for active transport, which is obviously it's a good thing on paper, but in practical reality.
The really important remarks you're making.
Sorry, I think I went over a bit there.
So we can keep to time. You've got 1 minute left. Okay.
Okay. I'll just quickly wrap up. Yeah, I think meaningful spending, education, I think is key. It's a holistic sort of young person's viewpoint. But yes, thank you. I'll pass on now. I think I've gone a bit over there.
Amogh, I'm sorry to have stopped you in your tracks, but you can come back in the question and answer and take up other comments you wanted to make. Thank you very much for what you said. Can I turn now to Niki Roach? Niki is convinced. Niki, please come forward so you're on the screen. Niki is convinced that by connecting the right people and thinking at a systems level, anything is possible. In her roles as past president of Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, the present director of Blue and Green Consulting, and host of the podcast Planet Possible, she spends her time looking for opportunities to connect people to solve some of our biggest challenges. Niki, over to you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you for the invitation to join you this evening. Gosh, I'm already really inspired. Amogh, there's so many things I want to talk to you about afterwards. So it was lovely to hear all of my fellow panelists. I was asked just to talk a little bit and reflect on the nature first talking point. And so I'm going to do that maybe a little differently to what we've heard already. I'm going to dive right into sort of the detail of a specific topic, just to give you a bit of a feel for that. So as Richard said in his introduction, I have spent my career working in and around the water sector, and at the moment I'm doing some work with a water company not in Yorkshire, I hasten to add, although connected to Yorkshire's work, thinking about how we can transition towards using more nature-based solutions. So I thought it might be interesting just to give you a bit of a flavour for what that looks and feels like, what's happening already, and where some of the challenges are really. So you may have seen in the news that there's quite a lot of interest in storm overflows and spills from combined sewer overflows nationally. It's something that the sector are grappling with, and in the last couple of days, and if you haven't seen and you're interested, it's worth having a look, Water UK have just published their National Storm Overflow Reduction Plan, and I'm going to look down at my notes so I don't get the numbers wrong, but the plan is setting out a target of achieving less than 10 spills across the board for every overflow in England and Wales by 2050, £96 billion worth of investment, which is ginormous, over 9,000 overflows. And in the next 5 years, approximately, regulators still to make some decisions, around £10 billion worth of investment. So without going into lots of detail, traditionally, storm overflows are things that are quite a kind of grey engineered solution, really. And the way that we manage flows in our network is through hard engineering, typically things like concrete tanks that hold water back in the system, or making sewers bigger, for example. There is a growing drive across the sector, and it's the work that I'm doing, to think about how we put nature first. In fact, Yorkshire Water have got an initiative called Nature First, and the water company that I'm working with have got one called Green First. And the whole point about that is to say, how do we work with nature rather than immediately leaping towards a kind of grey solution? So in practical terms, what that means is things like, well, optimizing what we've got, because obviously the best thing that we can do is build nothing new in some respects if we can optimize the system. But then is thinking about things like slowing the flow down. So the real issue with the way networks perform is that we get a peak flow, and that's what the networks struggle to cope with. So actually, how do we hold the water back naturally? So that might be things like swales, sustainable urban drainage, working with colleagues like Rachael in planning and highways authorities, and thinking in systems, really, because the water sector are only part of the water cycle and part of the landscape, really. So how do we slow the flow down? How do we separate surface water out? So I've got rainwater harvesting at my house. That is not an easy thing to do. If anyone wants to talk about that, drop me a message afterwards. But how do we get those kind of ideas? How do we take surface water, rainwater that doesn't need to go into the sewerage system out? And we can do that at large scale. We can do that at community scale. We can do that at individual scale. So there are individual actions we can all take if we want to, like things like water butts, for example. That's a really quick and easy way to do a nature first type solution, really, and it has a really big impact if we start to act at scale. But then at the other end of the scale, there are things that the water companies are already doing, and it goes without saying that there are multiple benefits from these kind of approaches. So there's the obvious one, which is we reduce the amount of spills that go into watercourses, and that's full stop a good thing to do. But then also, when you put nature-based solutions in, things that work with nature rather than hard engineering, obviously you're not pouring as much concrete, which reduces the carbon footprint of those solutions. but also you're typically creating environments that are much more pleasant to be around. So there's a kind of amenity benefit. There's typically a biodiversity benefit because you're putting planting into spaces that didn't have planting before. It's giving access, sometimes on a small scale, sometimes on a large scale, to green spaces that people might not have previously used. There's a kind of an onward sort of health benefit we've seen through green and blue social prescribing, that actually there are real benefits to people just being in and around nature. But there are challenges. So the plan that Water UK put in said 25% of those solutions that I talked about should be delivered through nature-based routes. The two water companies I'm familiar with are trying to look at everything through a nature-first lens, a green-first lens, acknowledging not everything can be delivered through that route. But to give you a feel for some of those challenges, skills. So Amogh talked about green jobs. Well, actually, the kind of things that we'll need people to do in order to deliver nature-based solutions, we've never done on this scale before. So we don't have both the skills and the capacity in the supply chain to do some of these things. So there's a real urgency around, if we want to transition to this, where are those people coming from and how do we train them in order to be competent? Sometimes these things take longer to deliver. That in itself is a challenge because I think there's a weight of expectation sometimes. So you want to put nature first. Nature is a lot slower sometimes to do stuff than a concrete tank. So how do we get that balance right? How do we work with the likes of highways, the likes of planning, to make sure that, for example, when a new development goes in, that we think about where that water is going to go, for example? Or how do we manage highway drainage? We just did a podcast episode on the challenges, and you might have seen it in the news recently, around highway drainage and where that goes and what's in it, actually, when you think about road runoff and where we want to put that as well. So the water sector is absolutely part of this interconnected system, and we have to work outside of our own silo in order to try and solve some of these challenges. So it's definitely not easy. It keeps me awake at night sometimes thinking about how we do it. But I guess I wanted to just provide a bit of an example to say that kind of nature first thinking is definitely finding its way right into the heart of possibly the biggest piece of infrastructure spending on the books that we've seen, certainly in England and Wales, for a good amount of time. And so there is a direction of travel that's positive, but there's a huge amount of work to do. And I think it's the sort of thing that the sector absolutely can't do by itself. Richard, I hope I'm all right for time. I forgot to set my timer, sorry.
That was perfect. Thank you very much, Niki. Lots of things in what we're saying. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We'll see you again soon. Paul, can you put your camera on, Paul, please?
I think my camera is on, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is.
Yes.
Come forward. I'm sorry. Let me just introduce you. Paul Hayes is a senior policy fellow at Leeds University Business School. Prior to taking this role, he was policy manager at Wakefield Council with over 20 years experience of local government and issues across the Yorkshire and Humber region. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I've been asked tonight to talk about joining up strategies in terms of the talking points, in particular around climate skills and economic strategies and how they can actually embed climate. One of the things I actually got to think about was, and it was a job I had back in the day in terms of, was actually identifying how many strategies Wakefield produced as a local authority, because nobody knew. And I've dug out the paperwork that I actually took with me, and there was around about 52. So that would be large scale strategy plans like the local plan that Rachael's doing for North Yorkshire, a lot of stuff that they have to do statutorily. So a local authority has a duty to produce a food safety plan, which most people don't know about. You know, there's stuff around highways, and this is also just an individual district rather than plans and strategies produced at sub-regional level, at regional level, produced by partners like the NHS. There are an awful lot of plans and strategies out there, the vast majority of which I think still at the moment will not engage with the climate agenda. There is something here about how do you do that and how do you make them all engage and how do you make them all align. Mel made some very good points around leadership and the opportunities for that. I think a bigger opportunity in some ways is culture and how you change a culture and how you develop a mainstream awareness of climate issues across organizations and across partnerships. And thinking about this, there's probably two ways to do this. One is around lateral thinking and selling the opportunities to people. I know people earlier have talked about the economic opportunities for the green economy. If I'm in terms of if I'm engaged in economics or I'm an economic development person, what I'm interested primarily is around how I can sustain and sustainable, how I can create jobs, how I can support businesses. Again, there's a lot of opportunities in the net zero. There's a lot of opportunities there also in terms of the risks around economic transition. That's not usually in someone's skill set around looking at the green agenda. There's a lot of colleagues now that are starting to emerge in local authorities and in combined authorities and nationally who's providing this information. And there's something about a brokerage that things like the Commission can do, can build that cultural awareness and get it to snowball, even into strategies you wouldn't actually think. Older people. Yeah, if you're writing an older people strategy and you need to be aware of the issues around heat that could impact on older people down the line, it starts to think that climate awareness is built into strategy you wouldn't actually think of historically would have any links to the climate agenda. I think the other one, and this may be useful for people in the audience in terms of if they want to engage and they want to shape and they want to influence, is around pretty much all strategies now go out to some form of consultation, some form of public engagement. And if you can actually say, where is the climate area of that and how can we engage with that? And here's some suggestions. A lot of the time you'll be kicking at an open door. People will want to, oh yes, we can add that in, we can build that one in. The engagement cycle and being proactive and engaging with organisations as to when they publish strategies and when those strategies are launched up. The other one also is about sharing metrics. Again, the cliche, what gets measured gets managed. So there's something about what are the metrics, how do we decide this? Again, it's linked to Niki's systems approach, that people are working towards the same objective and recognise they contribute to the same objective. And that, I think there are your 3 points of entry in terms of joining these strategies up. It's starting to come, and I think we'll reach a tipping point where it snowballs. And a good example is how public health have operated over the last decade, that pretty much public health now is mainstreamed into a lot of people's work. And I think you'll see the same with climate, but it still needs those ongoing pushes and that culture and that awareness. Again, EDI is another example about how that agenda is being mainstreamed into plans and strategies you wouldn't, that the people who were writing them a decade ago or even 5 years ago didn't think that there'd be any need that, so, or any need to embed that in, and things are now becoming embedded. So my message to people is keep pushing, keep engaging, keep saying, where's the climate in that plan or strategy, or where's the climate in your agenda? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Very, very clear on those entry points for strategizing climate. We've now got, I'm a little over time with regard to the agenda, but I wanted to allow the speakers to speak as fully as they can. I'm sorry again for interrupting you, Amogh, but I hope you come back in the Q&A. We have 35 minutes of Q&A. I have, just to go back to the opening remarks, either please put up your digital hand. I think I can cover everybody here. Or please put your questions in the Q&A. And can I ask Charlie or Kate, if something goes into the chat, can it be retrieved and put in the Q&A? Or if you have yourselves, those of you in the audience, put a question in the chat, can you put it back into the Q&A so I'm able to see as much as possible? I'm going to basically now turn to the questions and then turn back to our 5 panelists and ask, people who particularly would like to respond. I'm going to start with one that is immediately directed to Rachael from Mike Potter, to give time for people, the panelists, to look at the other questions, which I'll then pick up. After this, I'll probably go to Nick's question above Mike. So Mike is asking Rachael, with regard to relative planning policies at regional level in relation to national policy, what is the prioritization? Will, for example, the new North Yorkshire local plan be capable of taking precedence over government planning policy or lack thereof? Or will our hands, your hands, be tied? Rachael, if you could come back on that question, I'd be grateful.
Yes, happy to do that. Yes, so local planning policy always has to have regard to national planning policy. There's effectively what is called a chain of conformity. So when a local plan is examined, an examiner looks at it to assess whether or not the policies it has in it they still have to be locally distinctive. So that means that you can set standards, you can apply policies in a very locally specific way, but they have to be in that sort of general alignment and general conformity with national policy. And one of the key sort of areas of and I would say there is that sort of tension currently in frustration, is around the extent to which a local plan can set targets around building sustainability and design, which go above and beyond what building regulations requires. And that's going to be an area, I think, that this local plan will, and other local plans that are currently in production, some of them are going through examination. It is going to be a testing ground, I think, in terms of how we can effectively create a plan that's right for North Yorkshire, that looks at the different standards that we could create, that looks at the different opportunities we may have for significant renewable energy generation across the the authority area. There's going to need to be a very sort of, well, look at the strategic issues around and grasp those difficult issues around, well, where do we locate large scale renewable energy generation versus what that might mean for those communities in that local area, and politically that can be quite challenging. But essentially, a local plan is able to set policies that reflect the social, economic, and environmental conditions of a local area, of its plan area. It has to be in conformity with national policy, but it doesn't have to mirror it. It can have its own particular dimension. I hope that answers that question.
Rachel, thank you very much. Before I go on to another question, it's obviously it's a very important point. And Rachel, you've been very clear in your response. Any other member of the panel like to come back to this question on this point before I move on? Okay. I'll now turn to Nick's question. I've got David also who's got his hand up, I think, or it's clapping. I'm not sure whether that's a raised hand or not. Anyway, let me go to Nick Hodgkinson.
Sorry, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and then come back to you, David. For those of you who haven't got the Q&A in front of you, let me just go through it very quickly. At a national policy level, the UK Climate Change Committee has repeatedly recommended that there should be no expansion of UK airport capacity unless an aviation emissions mitigation strategy is in place and proven to be working on the scale and at the pace required for the aviation industry to become net zero by 2050. Will the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission support this call on the next government, or with regard to the next government? For Nick, this really matters for local plans and specific decisions by the Yorkshire and Humber local authority planners. Would anyone particular like to come back to that, or I'm going to turn to any of you? Rachel, I'm going to come back immediately to you, and I'm also going to go to Paul. As people involved in local government, could you, Paul, if you'd like to start, and then Rachel, if you could come in, and anybody else pick up that question. It's obviously a very important question, which we've heard for quite a period of time, but which is not going to go away very clearly.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in here, Richard.
Oh.
Again, what you've got then is a set of tensions between parties. Again, you have the planners, you'll have the environmental people in terms of engaging with, if we use airport growth as an area, but then you'll have the economic development people who say, look at the economic benefits of airports. So you need to look at this stuff around transition and how, again, I'm back on the concept of culture change and making the argument and having that debate. there's still a need in some cases to shift some economic thinking from the growth at any cost. There'll be a technical solution to climate issues. It will sort itself in the long run. There is still that view and that belief among some people, and that culture change point, I think, needs to be made in terms of something. There's still a view that the climate agenda, the green agenda, is anti-growth, it's anti-economic prosperity, which it isn't. It's a transitional agenda, and I think that is still something that the Climate Commission and other people involved in this will probably need, again, to look at those arguments and continue to make those arguments.
Rachael, do you want to follow up?
Well, I'll just echo really what Paul said there. There is you know, competing effectively tensions around this, and the extent to which a local plan would be considering that is really whether there's any drivers for change within the area of the local plan in terms of whether we have any proposals being submitted to consider, you know, expansion of airports, because I think that would be a strategic sort of consideration that really should be explored through a local plan examination process. That's yet to be tested. But of course, you can still have you know, an aerodrome, and you know, the usage from that could increase, and that's increasing CO2 emissions. But if there's no development on the ground, that's not something that the you know, from a planning point of view, from a development point of view, we would be able to you know, get involved in. But it's something that still does need to be discussed, I think, just more collectively in relation to this issue around helping to realise that economic development does not necessarily have to be bad for the environment, and what we should be looking to do is promote through the local plan, through a whole plethora of strategies that exist, you know, to promote technologies that you know, have either you know, a net zero or are you know, even carbon negative in their operations. So yeah, you know, that's all really I can say at this stage on that.
Thank you, Rachael. Thank you, Paul. Clearly, that question is not going to go away, but I want to move on. I'd like to go to David, who had his hand up earlier, from the North Yorkshire Climate Coalition. David, do you want to come in?
Yeah, Richard, if this is okay, this question, but tell me if it's not, and I'm very happy to leave it for another time. So it was to pick up on Mike Potter's question about the ambition level of North Yorkshire's emerging local plan vis-a-vis national regulations. Specific question, Rachael, if I may, is, okay, North Yorkshire, we're looking at 2027, possibly even a little bit further out before that local plan is in place. And currently we're still relying on the existing district level local plans, which are, some of which are actually reasonably ambitious, some less so. So this is the question. Has North Yorkshire considered as a quicker mechanism for achieving the kind of ambition level that we want on house building, for example, considered supplementary planning documents as an interim path, so that we're not, for the next 4 years, building new houses that will then potentially need retrofitting. So yeah, supplementary planning document with more stringent ambition levels.
We haven't explicitly considered a supplementary planning document in relation to sustainable building standards. They have been mentioned in various meetings for other sort of aligned issues around, for example, water quality and water consumption. The issue with SPD is the fact that they are not actually part of the formal development plan. They are a document that you prepare to amplify and support the implementation of the existing policy you have in your local plan. So if your policy in your local plan is a bit long in the tooth and doesn't really move things along, your supplementary planning document isn't really going to be able to change that. The other thing as well is that in preparing our new local plan for North Yorkshire, which is the largest authority in the country now and the third largest in population, and has been created through the effectively the merging of 7 local authorities and the county authority. we don't have the resources and the capacity to prepare effectively 7 new SPDs on what is quite a technical issue to support local plans that are already in place, but in many respects wouldn't have the necessary policy standards to, you know, which we can't then put into an SPD, because when you prepare a local plan, everything has to be triangulated. Any policy choices you make, any standards you set, say for around affordable housing contributions, you're factoring in biodiversity net gain, you're factoring in the costs of building standards and setting development proposals to a certain level of standard, whether it's to have PV or whether it's to have ground source heat pumps or air source heat pumps or the like, or some other form of decentralized energy. We have to understand how that could affect the viability of those proposals, because obviously when we're creating local plans, we are allocating sites for development. That could be housing sites, it could be other forms of land use. We have to be confident, and the inspector has to be confident that when those sites will actually come forward, because if they don't, what will happen is that there are various sort of national policy mechanisms which kick in, and they can start to undermine the policies that you have in your local plan, particularly around where development is located, and effectively allow windfall applications to come forward. So that is not something that a local planning authority wants to have, because it means that their existing local plan is undermined. But the key thing is that I can see why people want to move faster. They want to see change. They want to make things happen. And one thing is for certain, the preparation of a local plan is no fast process. It isn't. But trying to create SPDs off old local plans won't actually achieve what you want, because the policy basis on which those local plans was made, they don't have the ability to take forward, you know, new challenging standards. So it's not advocated to create SPDs that go above and beyond what you've already got on your local plan, because they would be challenged by the development industry. So it's not something that we feel is a prudent use of the resources that we have. We feel we need to focus on our new local plan. We've had to park some of our existing local plans that we were looking to review in order to make sure we focus on the new plan for North Yorkshire. And trying to create SPDs of old local plans would, whilst I can understand for some people they would want to do that, it would essentially be a distraction from what we really need to do, which is get our local plan in place.
Thank you, Rachel. David, do you want to make a comment back? I'm not going to ask Rachel to respond to it, any comment, but do you want to say anything in response to what Rachel has said?
Okay, I'll make a very big point, but I'm not expecting a response, because it's a long, complicated subject. Yeah. But Rachel, a thought that we have had is that you create a single template plan that would then require minimal tweaking across the 7 former district authorities. So whether that's viable or not, I don't know. Perhaps we can discuss that separately, and I'll send you an email about that one. Thanks for the opportunity to ask the question.
Great. Kate, do you want to come in? You've got your hand up, and then I'll turn to Muriel.
Yes, thanks, Richard. There was a comment in the chat from Jatinder, and he says we should be inspiring the younger population, but we give them despair to our lack of progress. But the young population always inspire me. Great to hear from Amogh. Thank you. And I just wondered whether, since we had to cut Amogh off earlier, whether he'd be able to come back in on a couple of the other points that I know he wanted to make.
I will do that within the time I've got. I think it's possible. Absolutely. That's really important comment, and thank you from the audience. Can I just go to Amogh? Can you be ready to come in? But can I just go to a question that is from Mel? You made a very important point, Mel, about the right. This is from Muriel. the right policy levers or interventions at the right time. In your experience, how do you identify these policy levers, and when is it the right time for them, if there is a best practice, in other words, or what would you need to try and identify these a bit more proactively? If you could come in, Mel, and then I will turn back to Amogh.
It's a great question. I think probably the answer is that there's no one right answer, but I think the really the earliest that you can flag, there's probably a couple of stages in that process, I guess. First of all, flagging to citizens or customers at the earliest opportunity that you can, that there is a change on its way. So you might not be able to flag exactly what that policy looks like in detail yet, but you can at least get people warmed up to the fact that there is going to need to be some kind of change. So a lot of the work that I do is in energy, so that's why my examples keep coming from there. But I was talking about the German example with gas boilers earlier. People have now started to grow in awareness about the fact that they're not always going to be able to have a gas boiler. But arguably, people are still not quite as aware of that as they could be. So stage one, I think, and that's the stage that, can and should be happening now, and it's a big part of community engagement, is just starting to flag with people, these are the things that will need to change, even if you can't say exactly yet, this is what it will look like, and this is how that change will look and feel. But then really, I think at the earliest available time is start to flag what those dates look like. And a really great and successful example of this actually was the work that government did to set a target for no longer using diesel cars. That's another great example where it gives people a long enough time period to be able to get themselves into a financial situation where they can deal with that change when it comes along and it doesn't leave them in a vulnerable situation. And I guess it's taken me a while to come to this answer, but perhaps that's the sweet spot. Perhaps that's the answer to your question, Muriel, is the right amount of time is the time that allows you to make that policy change in the time that you need to meet your carbon budget, but B, also gives people the amount of time that they need to be able to financially prepare, or whatever other kinds of preparations they need to be able to make to get there. So it's probably a bit of an art rather than a science.
Mel, thank you. I mean, it's really important, that point, isn't it, around ownership, and it's related to any notion of just transition. Thank you, and it's a great question as well. I'm gonna pick up Jatinder's comment. So about education still being needed. Amogh made the point very clearly that there was still a lack of knowledge of how climate was affecting people, and education was very important. Amogh, would you like to come back on that and further any points you wanted to make earlier, or respond to anything that has come up in the discussion so far?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. I think, yeah, education is needed a lot. I think a lot of people still hear a lot of terms and think and don't really know what they mean, especially green jobs, upskilling. I think it's quite, the terms that they hear a lot, but they think they don't, especially young people who are going out of education, going into jobs in maybe 2, 3, 4 years' time, who still don't know what path they can take. They don't know the options available to them. And even people who are already in this different sectors, I don't think they also understand how they could probably upskill, get into a sort of a greener job, a green profession. I think advertisement showing what what green jobs actually are, explaining them to people in a way that they can understand, in a way that's accessible, why we need them, where can they find more information, where can I actually find green jobs, when are they, you know, sort of going to be available, when are they going to come out, when is everything going to happen. I think it's very, very important that we address these issues, along with, obviously, you know, sort of national and regional scale infrastructure developments, and I think that's come up a lot. I think the sort of just going down into a more local level, I think is quite important as well. Just, you know, touching, sort of going back to square one, understanding the problems, consulting with people. How is climate change affecting you? You know, we had the floods in Sheffield and Ratcliffe and Rotherham last year, and we had quite bad flooding. I think it was in 2019, 2011 as well, I think. And I think it's just going back to these communities that have actually been affected by climate change, gathering their information, how they've been affected personally, and then sort of collating this into a more accessible, into a way that anyone can understand, and, you know, trying to empower people to actually make change instead of just, you know, it's great talking about climate change as these forums. I think they're amazing, but the real deal is acting, and, you know, talking is the first step. Educating, I think, is the second step, and obviously, if we don't act upon anything that we say or we pledge that we're going to do, then, you know, none of it's useful. There's no point in doing anything if nothing's going to come. No, we're not, you know.
Amogh, thank you, and please do come back. We still have some time. I'd like to go to Andrew, and then I'd like to bring in Mel to respond to Vicky. I am aware that Ian set up a question right at the beginning, which we haven't come to, which is around food security and nature recovery. Niki, I know you're in water, not in agri-food, but I'm wondering whether the principle of the question you could possibly not respond to, but articulate a kind of response in principle. I know that Rosa, the director of the commission, was going to come in earlier, or wanted to come in earlier. I'm sorry, I didn't pick up your chat, Rosa. If you would like to come in at any point, please just put up your hand, and I will note Rosa and make sure that you can come in. So firstly, Andrew, then Mel, back to Vicky, and then Niki, back to Ian in terms of the Q&A. And Rosa, if you want to come in, please stick up your hand. Andrew.
Thank you. It's a continuation of the points about skills and education. So Amogh, in his opening talk, said that he thought maybe education was missing from this conversation, and I just wondered whether from hearing what other speakers have said about skills gaps and so forth, we have referred to skills in the talking points just in terms of joining up strategies, but I wondered whether any of the other panelists had kind of any reflections on whether there is something, you know, something else that we need to be saying about skills that isn't articulated in the talking points. Thank you.
Great. Well, that's a very direct question to the panelists. Does anyone want to come back to Andrew immediately? Paul, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think Andrew's right about where skills can be approached, because again, skills need to be linked to economic transition and also to the economic impact of the transition on certain areas. For example, I'm thinking about places in the region that have, for example, large and existing steelworks or chemical or old smokestack industries. So there is something about linking that skills agenda to that transition agenda and being far more proactive than we are at the moment. At the moment, if you look at skills, it's seen as about basic skills around getting higher level skills, but it's not about linked to industry transition. If we're not careful, we'll have the same issue that happened when the mining industry died. That transition was not taken account of, and it took 20 years. And even then, you could argue in some communities, 30, 40 years later, that legacy and that scarring still remains. So there's something about being quite proactive about which communities and which groups are going to be affected. And then do we target and focus skills investment and skills programs around those communities?
Thank you,
Richard.
Paul. Yep.
Oh, sorry, it's Niki. Could I just add one thing? Would you mind?
Yes, Niki, come in.
Thanks, Paul. That was really made me think. The only thing I guess I was reflecting on, given that these are climate talking points, is around the need for a degree of certainty around some of those things. So it's I agree with what I've heard Paul say, and I guess I would just add, right at the beginning we heard Mel talk about the certainty that we've got from phasing out for diesel cars, for example, and actually what we need is that long-term thinking from elected officials, so that then gives industry certainty, so that then all the skills and that we need can follow on from that. So I suppose that's for me just important to, when we think about those talking points, to push for that need for a clear direction of travel, really, almost regardless of who's in charge, that this is where we're going and we'll stick to it, so that we can then start to respond. Business will respond really quickly, but things like skills take time to bed in. And if you want to get to that really quite granular local, here's the kind of thing we could put in this region because we've got this infrastructure or whatever that might look like, actually that will all take time too. So for me, there's something about just a bit more certainty, really, and substance, so that industry can then start to make commitments and investments on top of it. That's all. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Niki.
Sorry, can I just add on to that?
Yes.
I just want to add on to what Niki just said. I think the government should definitely I think it's definitely worth government and local, authorities, local councils, doing whatever they can make a combined effort with businesses to create maybe training packages, apprenticeships, the opportunity to upskill into a green job, I think needs to be definitely addressed and looked at. And I think starting those conversations with those businesses, with those leaders in those sectors, I think would be very, very useful as well.
Amogh, thank you. So there's Vicky's question. Mel, could you come in on? Some barriers exist grid capacity, e.g. preventing large-scale solar panels, as well as infrastructure, facilitate district heating systems, for example. How do we overcome issues such as these? Mel, would you like to come in?
Yeah, and thanks for bringing it up, Vicky, because actually that underpinning infrastructure is it's something that people don't think about a lot. They just think about the kind of demand measures or the generation measures, whatever it is, kind of at the end of those pipes and wires. But you're absolutely right. Quite a lot of investment needs to happen to that underpinning infrastructure to make any of this stuff happen. And I think it's been quite public. There are real issues in terms of the length of time it takes to connect new renewable generation to the electricity grid. I think because of the kind of mounting pressure on that, there is now quite a lot of work ongoing, and some of it's investment in assets and some of it is just making the process a bit better. So, for example, people who've been on the list to connect for years and then haven't done it, just being taken off so that somebody else can be. So things like that. But the reason I was particularly excited by your question was it gave me a really good excuse to talk about a couple of things that have happened recently that really link into that first talking point about using local targets and empowering places to get on with things. And I think there've been a couple of really positive movements on that in the energy space in the last year that happened in a new piece of legislation called the Energy Act. And people aren't really aware of it at the moment, but I think it does give places quite a lot of interesting powers. The first one was that places, well, local government in particular, were empowered to designate places as district heating zones. And it means that they've got a new power that if they designate these district heating zones, they can compel large energy users to connect to them. So that's a really exciting change, I think, and very empowering for local government in terms of making the sorts of infrastructure that you're talking about, Vicky, commercially viable in a way that they couldn't before. And the second big thing that nobody's noticed yet that came out of the Energy Act was something called regional energy strategic plans, which sound a bit boring, and that's fair enough. But up until now, all energy policy has just been done on a national level, and there's kind of been the assumption that just everywhere will look the same at the end of this transition. But I think there's always been this acknowledgement that actually different places might want different solutions, different mixes of solutions. And up until now, the regulator Ofgem hasn't really known what to do with that. That's a bit complicated, isn't it? It's much easier just to have one very simple national energy system and you can just get on with it. These regional energy systems plans will basically be local areas, local places coming together at a regional level to say, this is what the energy system needs to look like in our area. And that will give an opportunity to not have a single one-size-fits-all approach to what we want energy to look like within our local areas. So there's some really interesting things happening and on the horizon that will really address the need for investment in that infrastructure, but we'll do it in a way that is really genuinely rooted in local places, and that's really new.
Thank you, Mel, and thanks, Vicky, for the question. I've lost the question on food and nature.
Richard, if you look in the answered section, it's because someone had typed an answer to it.
Okay, fine.
It is in there.
I've got it. That's fine. Niki, do you want, I mean, on the question of nature first, you're obviously working on water, but would you want to say anything finally before I sort of close the discussion in relation to these kinds of the correlation between nature first and any form of agri-food production?
Yeah, I'll be really brief. Thanks, Ian, for the question. And yeah, definitely not an area that I am that I'm a practitioner in, but I have an awareness of, and also one of our climate commissioners works for Natural England. So I've frantically messaged him as well whilst your question came in and said, what do you think? So between us, I think the best response we can give is around elms, which you might be familiar with, Ian, already, but the Environmental Land Management Scheme. So there are 3 different types of elms: the Sustainable Farming Incentive, the Countryside Stewardship, and Landscape Scale Recovery. And elms in general is there to try and promote environmentally sustainable and climate goods and services, really. So there is a mechanism. Certainly with my SIWM hat on, we've just published a report called A Fresh Water Future. And one of the things that we're calling for is a water standard within elms in the future, so that actually rather than water being embedded into some of those targets, it's pulled out at top line level. And the other thing I would say is that I'm aware that DEFRA are updating the land use framework at some point in 2024 as well. And one of the things that that certainly with my Planet Possible hat on, we're talking about doing an episode on is around land use frameworks and what good looks like, really, because there's probably, I don't want to sound too controversial, but there's probably a bit of a gap in terms of what we want our land to do across England and Wales and and devolved administrations more generally. What do we want our land to do? How do we want to best use it? How do we get that balance between food security and environmental goods and services and all the other things that are going on, housing and so on, right? So I don't know if that's helpful, Ian, or not. It may not have added any value to what you already knew, but things to check out. Elms, certainly. Freshwater Future's worth a look, and keep an eye out on DEFRA producing hopefully a new land use framework later on this year as well. Thanks, Richard. Thanks for the question, Ian.
Is there anybody from the panel who would like to make a final comment before I wrap up the discussion and just make a few final comments before ending the event as a whole? Would anyone like to make a final comment? Okay, anyone from the audience would like to come in at this final point? Neil, you have your hand raised. Neil.
It's just a real quickie. I just want to thank Paul for his comment on transition and recognizing that transition. My family, my father, my uncles, grandfather, extended family were coal miners. I'm from Shirebrook in Derbyshire. They all mined in that Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire coalfield. Those communities haven't recovered all. They absolutely have been gutted. They have been kicked to pieces. Those mines had to close, no dispute on that. But the transition, but they were closed savagely and they were closed instantly, and there was no underpinning transition or consideration given to those communities in terms of upskilling them for an alternative. And as a consequence of that, when I go back home to Shirebrook, that is a town of 13,500 people when I was growing up. It's down to about 9,000 people now. Most of the shops are closed. It's not the place I was growing up in. So I just want to say thank you, Paul, because I think it's so important that we recognise the investment that we need to make in as we do this transition in upskilling people for those that may be left behind in this. So that was just my point, Richard. Thank you for allowing me to do that.
No, brilliant. And that works back with what Amogh was saying about upskilling into green jobs, the vital importance of that and the investment required. I think there's been an awful lot here. I'm not going to try and summarize, and I don't have the time to do it. But it seems to me very clear that what everyone's very concerned about is both the planning process, about how one can accelerate it, but at the same time remain faithful to what is required in a planning process at a local level, the relationship between that and the national level, which will clearly change in the coming, by next year. And at the same time, the empowerment of communities with regard to local targets, the ownership required there, and that this is underpinned, which is something that the Commission really foregrounds. This is underpinned by just transition. The absolute importance of dealing with this overall transition to a low carbon economy and all that works with that. In terms of co-benefits, that it is underpinned by a sense of fairness and equity. Clearly, when the mining communities were closed down in the 1980s, that it wasn't under a climate prerogative. We all know that, very different reasons. But at the same time, Yorkshire is precisely the place that has learnt the most about that legacy and can therefore actually move with confidence and with historical legacy into what is required now. I really thank everybody on the panel for their contributions. I'd like to thank the organisers behind the Secretariat of the Commission as a whole for making this possible, and to all the audience that has stayed. There are quite a lot of you that have stayed. It's quite late in the day, especially if we have childcare obligations. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to make a couple of comments, and there will be a couple of slides that will come up to make sure that people can engage more with the Commission. The climate talking points are about us engaging in climate action, and particularly in a year of elections, both local and national, so that we can, as I think Kate's put it, we can or Andrew's put it, we can cut through the noise and make very clear points about climate. And that goes back to Paul's points about getting climate right there within a process so that climate engagement is clear. We do want people also to get involved with the Climate Commission's work. We have active public conversations. See the QR code, which is now on the screen, and link in the chat to go to our link tree. This will give you links to our ongoing surveys, and you can also read the climate talking points and our climate action plan. It's a very detailed climate action plan, which reverberates with quite a lot of what has been said tonight under the climate talking points for the Yorkshire and Humber region. The Commission's next public event will be in June and will focus on an important new piece of work called Our Carbon Story. This is new insight into the region's carbon emissions, going back to the historical legacy that this region is embedded in, and crucially, which actions should be prioritized now to make the biggest difference to cutting carbon while bringing real benefits to the region. Yes, let me hold it there. Make sure you've signed up to our mailing list to receive information about this and other events. Fill out the Keep in Touch form on our website. So we very much want you to get involved, particularly this year when a lot of political decisions or political choices will be made by us citizens, and that we're able to foreground climate within any planning process, to go back to what a lot of people were saying earlier. That is it. It's time. I think we'd all love this to go on. It's not possible, but please join us again in June in the next public event, and do take up the QR code on the screen. Thank you very much indeed to everybody, and have a very good evening. Goodbye.